Right before you reset, everything gets quieter than you expected. It doesn't explode. It doesn't feel like fireworks or relief or some dramatic release. It just stops grabbing you. It doesn't give you proof. It doesn't give you momentum. It doesn't even give you a story to cling to. What actually happens is stranger. The noise drops out, and what's left feels almost unsettlingly neutral. And in that neutral, the urgency evaporates, the chase loosens, and you realize you're not falling behind. You're slipping out of interference. For the first time, your system stops demanding anything. That silence you're noticing is not a sign that you missed your moment. It's the sign that the old momentum stopped working on you. When the mind no longer receives the same payoff from forcing, it begins to withdraw energy from it, and that withdrawal feels like emptiness because you were trained to call noise progress. But this silence is not stagnation. It's a corridor. You expected the shift to announce itself like chaos turning into clarity. You expected fireworks, a surge, a dramatic emotional release. And when none of that shows up, you label the neutral as failure. You label the quiet as nothing is happening. But what's happening is more precise than your emotions. The system is stripping away the hooks. It is removing the little chemical contracts that kept you chasing, checking, refreshing, needing reassurance every few minutes. Quiet breaks those contracts. It's not burnout. It's not laziness. It's not collapse. It's compression. The pressure you feel is not life pushing you down. It's the field narrowing, reducing randomness, removing the excess. And that narrowing is uncomfortable because the ego survives by expanding every sensation into a story. Silence starves the story. Silence doesn't argue. Silence doesn't negotiate. Silence doesn't give your mind material. That's why it feels like you're losing something when you're actually losing distortion. This is why the neutral feels unsettling. Not because you're broken, but because you're not being pulled. The mind hates this because it can't bargain with it. It can't turn it into urgency. When there's no urgency, the mind loses its favorite tool, monitoring. And monitoring is not awareness. Monitoring is interference. Presence doesn't watch for results. Presence becomes the result. So you start to notice the difference between movement and progress. Movement is frantic. Movement is compulsive. Movement is just do something. Progress is quiet. Progress is when the nervous system stops flinching. Progress is when you can sit inside an unfinished moment without turning it into a crisis. That's why the corridor feels narrow. It strips away performance. It strips away the need to prove. From a quantum perspective, you don't need more movement. You need less distortion. You don't need more effort. You need alignment. The signal was always there, but it was buried under constant checking, constant adjusting, constant trying to force the next feeling. Noise loves activity. Signal loves coherence. And coherence always begins as a quiet that feels too ordinary to trust. The doorway never looks like a doorway. It looks like nothing. That's the trap. That's the test. If you're sitting in that flatness, don't interpret it as lack. Lack is loud. Lack begs. Lack chases. This is different. This is the strange moment where wanting starts to dissolve, not because you gave up, but because the system stops offering your attention as fuel to the old loop. Spiritually, this is indifference, not apathy, but a quiet knowing that effort rooted in lack is no longer necessary. The desperation drops first. The clarity comes later. And you'll notice the mind immediately tries to sabotage it by inventing problems to solve. It tries to drag you back into friction, because friction feels familiar. But familiarity is not truth. Familiarity is conditioning. The mind would rather feel anxious and busy than quiet and undefined, because undefined is where it can't control you. But this corridor is narrow on purpose. It doesn't allow overthinking. It doesn't allow bargaining. It only allows presence. It only allows you to stop touching the process. Think of it like gravity in reverse. The harder you push, the more you fragment. But when you stop pushing, the fragments begin to align without effort. Not because you commanded them, but because interference dropped. This is the threshold, a quiet corridor where nothing feels dramatic. Yet everything is reconfiguring beneath your awareness right now. You're not waiting for the shift. You're inside the space where the shift becomes inevitable. The silence isn't the end. It's the end of resistance. You're suspended, not stuck. Neuroscience explains this in a way that strips the mystery down to mechanics. When you slow and steady the breath, you're not calming down through willpower. You're sending a pattern into the system. And the system responds through the branch that was built for settling, restoring, and letting go. The parasympathetic. Most people think their state is controlled by thoughts, so they try to think their way out of tension. They try to reason with urgency. They try to talk themselves into safety. But the nervous system doesn't speak the language of explanations. It speaks the language of signals, rhythm, timing, repetition. That's why paced breathing matters. Not because it's a trick, because it's a lever. There's a specific kind of communication happening between the breath and the heart. Not as poetry, as coordination. When the respiratory rhythm is guided, the heart's rhythm can begin to move with it, like two metronomes finding the same tempo. This is entrainment. It's the body matching a pattern. And when that matching happens, the message isn't try harder. The message is stand down. This is why the shift often feels like nothing, because the system doesn't announce parasympathetic activation with fireworks. It announces it with absence, less gripping, less scanning, less internal commentary. The mind calls that empty. The body calls that regulation. And if you've lived your life equating pressure with progress, regulation will feel unfamiliar, suspicious. You're not weak for needing a pattern. You're human. The idea that you should be able to snap into peace by force is one of the loudest myths on the internet. Force is sympathetic. Force is bracing. Force tightens the loop you're trying to escape. Paced breathing moves in the opposite direction. It doesn't fight the system. It offers the system an alternative rhythm and lets biology do what biology does. From a quantum perspective, think of your inner state like a field full of interference. Thoughts collide, emotions overlap, attention scatters into 100 directions at once. You call it overthinking, but it's really a signal buried under noise. And you keep trying to fix the signal by adding more noise, more analysis, more checking, more effort. That's not alignment. That's amplification of interference. A steady breath is not a miracle. It's a reduction of variables. It's less randomness injected into the field, less fluctuation, less chaotic sampling of every possible outcome. The mind hates that because it can't feed on it. It can't turn it into drama. It can't turn it into a problem to solve. So it says, this isn't working. But that statement is the last echo of the old mode trying to pull you back. Here's the mini twist. The goal is not to feel instantly better. The goal is to become less reactive. Better is a sensation. Reactivity is a mechanism, and mechanisms shift first. Sensations lag behind. When you introduce paced breathing, you're not chasing relief. You're creating coherence between systems that were running out of sync. That's the switch. This is why people sabotage themselves right here. They start monitoring the breath like it's a performance. They turn rhythm into a test. They demand proof. They keep checking for a mood change, and every check reintroduces interference. Monitoring is not presence. Monitoring is control disguised as awareness. Presence is quieter. Presence holds the rhythm without gripping it. So if you're in that corridor, understand what's happening beneath your interpretation. A paced breath can engage parasympathetic pathways, and the coupling between breathing rhythm and heart rhythm is part of the mechanism people describe when they talk about regulation. That means you're not doing nothing when you do less. You're not losing momentum. You're changing the governing system. And the moment you stop calling that neutral failure, your relationship to the silence changes. The silence becomes the space where interference drops, where signal can register, where effort rooted in lack stops being necessary. Not because you convinced yourself, because the system received a pattern, and it responded all at once. There's a frequency where the system stops arguing with itself. Not because you forced it into calm, because you found the rhythm it naturally recognizes. That's what resonant breathing points to. It isn't a vibe, it's a meeting place, where the body's timing lines up enough for signal to travel without being shredded by noise. Most people treat breathing like a background function, something that happens while you think, chase, fix, and monitor. But resonance doesn't care about your plans. Resonance cares about pattern. When the pattern is steady, the system has less to fight. And when there's less to fight, what you experience as silence isn't emptiness, it's coherence arriving. The mind will try to make this small because it sounds too ordinary to matter. It will say, it's just breath. But that is the same voice that calls stillness, laziness, and calls peace a lack of ambition. The truth is, your state is not built on dramatic moments. It's built on oscillations, tiny cycles that repeat until your whole reality feels like a corridor or a collapse. So when you shift the cycle, you shift the corridor. There's a reason researchers describe a resonant breathing frequency around 0.1 Hz, meaning a single breath cycle every 10 seconds. Not as a rule you have to obey, as a reference point for where the system tends to lock in. And when it locks in, the point isn't to chase a high. The point is to reduce interference. From a quantum perspective, resonance is what happens when randomness stops dominating the field. Your attention becomes less scattered. Your internal signal becomes less corrupted. It's not that life suddenly becomes perfect. It's that the signal stops being drowned out by constant micro-panics, constant adjustments, constant checking for proof. That's why this feels quiet. Not because nothing is happening, because the noise can't survive in that rhythm. This is the mini twist. Silence is not the absence of energy. Silence is the absence of wasted energy. The mind confuses the two because it was trained to feel alive only when it's reacting. But reaction is not aliveness. Reaction is conditioning. Resonance pulls you out of conditioning by doing one thing. It makes your system predictable enough to stop bracing. You can feel this as a softening that has no story attached, no explanation, no emotional fireworks, just a subtle release of the grip that was tightening without your permission. And the mind immediately tries to name it, because naming gives it ownership. It will call it boredom. It will call it nothing. It will call it, this isn't working. But that commentary is the last layer of interference trying to keep you in motion. Resonance is not a hack. It's a reset of timing. It's the difference between slamming on a door and finding the key. The door doesn't open because you tried harder. It opens because you match the mechanism. This is why effort and alignment are not the same thing. Effort pushes. Alignment matches. And when you match, you notice something unsettling. Your urgency drops before your circumstances change. Your need dissolves before you get proof. Your nervous system loosens its grip on the future without being convinced by logic. That's when you realize the corridor was never outside of you. It was the internal bandwidth narrowing, the system choosing signal over noise, coherence over monitoring. That's why it feels like a doorway with no signage. You expect a surge, and you get simplicity. You expect answers, and you get quiet. But simplicity is not weakness, it's precision. It's the system returning to the frequency where it can regulate without drama, where the next thought doesn't hijack the whole field and calls it. Silence is the signal getting stronger, not louder, clearer, less distorted, less interrupted. And in that clarity, you don't have to manufacture peace. You just stop interrupting it. That's the whole secret. The rhythm does not create your state. It reveals what your state looks like when interference stops. 30 seconds is not a promise. It doesn't fix your life. It doesn't erase anxiety. It doesn't guarantee anything. And if you treat it like a spell, you will sabotage the entire point before it even starts. Because the real reset never begins as a result. It begins as a pause in interference. You're not getting a new state in 30 seconds. You're stopping the old state from hijacking every signal in 30 seconds. That's why it feels small. That's why the mind dismisses it. The mind only respects what looks dramatic. But regulation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like less. This is why the research around breathing practices is often misunderstood. People hear breathing and they assume instant transformation. But a large scientific review that examined dozens of studies doesn't treat breathing like magic. It treats it like training. It looks at variables, the pace of the breath, whether there is human-guided instruction, how many sessions occur, whether practice continues over time, and how long the sessions last. That's not hype. That's structure. And here's the twist. Structure is the opposite of desperation. Desperation demands a shortcut. Structure builds a channel. When you demand a miracle in 30 seconds, you amplify noise. You turn the moment into a performance. You start scanning for proof, monitoring your body, chasing a sensation. And that chasing is sympathetic. It's interference pretending to be effort. So the phrase 30 seconds should be heard as a marker, not a guarantee. A marker is something you use to interrupt a loop. It's a line in the sand your nervous system can recognize. A guarantee is something your mind uses to bargain with reality. And bargaining is what keeps you stuck in urgency. It doesn't work because you believed hard enough. It works when you stop injecting contradictions. If you slow down for a brief window and the mind immediately starts yelling, "Is it working yet?" you just reopened the noise channel. You just reintroduced randomness into the field. You didn't fail. You interfered. That is different. The review doesn't reduce everything to one perfect method. It points to components and conditions that matter. Pace matters. Guidance matters. Repetition matters. Continuation matters. Duration matters. In other words, the state you want is not a switch you flip once. It's coherence you return to, over and over, until the system trusts the signal more than the alarm. So when someone sells you 30 seconds as a cure, notice the energy of that claim. It's urgency wearing a white coat. It's the same mindset that says, if you're not better immediately, it's pointless. But your nervous system does not rewire on your timeline of impatience. It rewires on the timeline of consistency. And this is why the quick part is not the result. The quick part is the decision to stop sabotaging. 30 seconds can be enough time to stop tightening, enough time to stop scanning, enough time to let the signal register without being smothered by commentary. What it can do is open a window, not a miracle. A window. A window is brief, and it matters because it proves something to your body. You can exist without urgency for a moment. And once that's proven, the system has a reference. The next time you return, it isn't foreign. It's familiar. That's how coherence builds. Not through fireworks, through repetition. If you need fireworks to trust it, you will miss it. The quiet is the proof. The calm is the data your body reads. So treat this as a test, not a technique. A test of whether you can stay with silence without demanding it entertain you. A test of whether you can reduce noise without replacing it with analysis. A test of whether you can stop forcing long enough for the deeper system to take the wheel. Because the reset you're looking for doesn't arrive as a sensation you chase. It arrives as the moment you stop chasing, and the signal finally has room to land. This is where most people sabotage themselves. The moment the system goes neutral, the mind panics and tries to manufacture urgency. It hates the corridor. It hates the pause. It hates the absence of fireworks. Because urgency is not just a feeling. It's a chemical identity the mind learned to call control. So when the signal finally starts to clear, the mind doesn't celebrate. It interrogates. It starts scanning for proof, demanding immediate feedback, looking for a symptom to confirm that something is happening. And the instant it starts monitoring, it injects noise back into the field. Monitoring is not presence. Monitoring is interference. You think you're being responsible. You think you're being careful. You think you're being smart. But what you're actually doing is turning a reset into a performance. You're asking a quiet system to entertain you. You're asking alignment to show up wearing chaos. This is the first sabotage pattern, the hunger for a sign. You look for the shift as a sensation. You look for the shift as a high. You look for the shift as a dramatic emotional release. And when it doesn't arrive on demand, you label the silence as failure. You call the neutral state nothing. But neutral is not nothing. Neutral is compression. It's the system stripping away excess, so signal can travel without distortion. The second sabotage pattern is constant checking. You keep returning to the question of, am I calmer yet? Is it working yet? Did it change? That looping question is not curiosity. It's dependence. It's the mind trying to reclaim the wheel through analysis. But analysis is not always intelligence. Sometimes it is just fear in a lab coat. And the more you check, the more you increase randomness. You turn coherence into a moving target. You trade presence for surveillance. You trade the inner channel for a scoreboard. Noise loves scoreboards. Signal does not. The third sabotage pattern is endless switching. The mind will try one rhythm for a moment, then abandon it, then chase a new one, then chase another. Not because it is seeking truth, but because it is addicted to novelty as a form of urgency. It calls that optimization. It calls that research. It calls that being proactive. But it is not progress. It is movement. And movement is not progress. Here is the twist. The mind's version of helping is often the very thing that blocks the shift. The mind thinks more input will solve it, more techniques, more effort, more stimulation. But the shift doesn't come from adding. It comes from subtracting interference until the simplest signal becomes obvious. That's why the neutral phase feels uncomfortable. There is no drama to hold on to. There is no story to rehearse. There is no urgency to feed. And for a mind trained on urgency, that emptiness feels like danger. So it creates a problem. It creates a deadline. It creates a new doubt. It creates a new reason you're behind. Not because it is cruel, but because it is conditioned. This is why so many people quit right before coherence. Not because nothing is happening, but because something is happening that doesn't flatter the ego. It's quiet. It's slow. It's subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly reduces noise. So if you find yourself getting restless, don't interpret that as a sign to stop. Interpret it as a sign that the old identity is losing its payoff. The urgency is fading, and the mind wants it back. It will call the silence boring. It will call the stillness pointless. It will call the corridor a waste of time. But that is not truth. That is withdrawal. And if you can see that, you can stop cooperating with it. You can stop trying to win the practice. You can stop demanding evidence every second. You can let the system do what systems do when they are finally allowed to regulate. Move toward coherence. The mind calls it boredom. The body calls it rewiring. This is why neuroscience doesn't measure magic. It measures resilience. Because the real reset isn't a rush. It's what your system can sustain when pressure returns, when the mind gets loud again, when the environment tries to pull you back into interference. A pilot study described exactly this kind of test. Not a vibe check, not a motivational moment, a cognitive stressor. And instead of asking people how they felt, it measured autonomic response through heart rate variability. That matters, because HRV is not a story your mind tells. It's a signal your nervous system broadcasts. In that design, the comparison wasn't philosophical. It was structured around preconditioning groups. One group used synchronized breathing paired with rhythmic muscle contraction. Another group used rhythmic muscle contraction alone. And the breathing and contraction were synchronized at 0.1 Hz, not as a performance, but as a rhythm the system could lock onto. Then the stressor arrived. And the question became simple. Which setup shows a more resilient parasympathetic response under cognitive load? Here's what was reported. The synchronized breathing plus rhythmic muscle contraction group showed a higher parasympathetic response than the contraction alone group during the stressor. 45.9% higher, with p less than 0.001. Read that slowly. Not felt better. Not manifested faster. A higher parasympathetic response during stress, and the difference was statistically strong. This is the part most people miss. They think resilience is a sensation. They think it's the high. They think it's the relief. They think it's finally feeling light. But resilience is quieter than that. Resilience is the ability to keep parasympathetic influence online even when something tries to trigger you. It's coherence that survives contact with pressure. So when you're looking for proof, don't look for fireworks. Fireworks are sympathetic. Fireworks are intensity. Fireworks are the mind begging for confirmation through stimulation. But the parasympathetic system doesn't announce itself like that. It stabilizes, it regulates, it restores. It doesn't scream, it holds. And that's the reframe. You don't need to become more forceful. You need to become more stable. You don't need more effort. You need less interference. You don't need to push the signal harder. You need to stop contaminating it with constant checking. Because coherence isn't created by urgency. It's created by alignment. And alignment looks boring to a mind addicted to chaos. Alignment looks slow. Alignment looks like nothing is happening. Until the moment you realize the system has changed its default. That's why synchronizing a rhythm matters in the first place. Not because rhythm is a trick, but because rhythm gives the body a pattern it can follow without negotiation. The mind can argue. The body can entrain. The mind can doubt. The body can coordinate. And when breathing and rhythmic muscle contraction are synchronized, you're not just doing two things. You're reducing internal conflict. You're taking two moving parts and making them speak the same language, so the measurement becomes meaningful. Under a cognitive stressor, a more resilient parasympathetic response suggests the system is not collapsing into old reflexes as easily. It's not being dragged into pure reactivity. It has more capacity to stay regulated while still being challenged. That's the kind of reset you can trust, not a mood, not a peak, a response pattern, a nervous system that can hold coherence when life doesn't cooperate. That's what resilience is, and that's what the data was pointing toward. And notice what it doesn't require. It doesn't require you to win a mental argument. It doesn't require you to become a different personality. It doesn't require self-surveillance. In fact, the more you monitor for results, the more you inject noise into the very channel you're trying to clear. Presence is cleaner than monitoring. A steady rhythm is cleaner than frantic optimization. Movement is not the same as progress. Sometimes progress is simply the nervous system choosing quiet over reaction. That's the switch. Not excitement, capacity, not intensity. Coherence. Not chasing breakthrough. Training the system to stay whole when it's challenged. Again and again. If you're waiting for a single perfect technique, you're already back in noise. Because the nervous system doesn't stabilize through novelty. It stabilizes through repeatable signal. And that's why the most underrated part of this whole process is not the breath itself, but the anchor you attach to it. A systematic review looking across voluntary breathing interventions points to something people don't want to hear. Outcomes are linked to parameters. Pace matters. Guidance matters. The number of sessions matters. Long-term practice matters. Duration matters. Not as a moral judgment, as a design reality. The nervous system is not impressed by intensity. It responds to consistency. And buried inside that is a quiet warning. Fast-only breathing is not the flex people think it is. Short sessions under 5 minutes are not the shortcut people hope they are. Some conditions look more conducive when you slow down and you actually stay with it. When you train with a human-guided voice. When you do it more than once. When you keep doing it. Not because a voice is magical, but because it reduces decision-making. And decision-making is interference. This is where people misunderstand anchor. They turn it into a hack. They turn it into a trick. They turn it into another way to chase a result. But an anchor is not a promise. An anchor is a reference point. It's a signal you return to when your mind starts scanning the field for proof. From a quantum perspective, it's the difference between a coherent wave and scattered particles. Not because you're bending physics, because you're describing attention. Coherence is what happens when the same message repeats without contradiction. Interference is what happens when you keep switching messages mid-transmission. So if you need a marker, use this. Not to beg the universe, not to control the outcome, but to stop your mind from reopening the door every 10 seconds. A marker is a micro-commitment to signal, a refusal to turn monitoring into a lifestyle. Here's the simplest form of that anchor. Let a human voice guide the rhythm, and let your job be to follow. The review language is almost embarrassingly plain. Follow human voice guidance. It can be as short as 5 minutes. Do it more than once. Keep doing it. That's not a ritual, that's a pattern. And patterns are what your nervous system trusts. Notice how different that is from do this once and it fixes you. That fantasy is noise, because it makes you hunt for fireworks. It makes you evaluate your body like a dashboard. And the moment you start evaluating, you raise interference. This is why the anchor has to be behavioral, not emotional. You don't anchor to feeling calm. You anchor to repeating the signal. You anchor to pace. You anchor to guidance. You anchor to duration that isn't trying to cheat the system. You anchor to enough sessions that the body stops treating it like a random event. So I'm going to give you a marker you can place outside your head. Write this in the comments, not as a performance, but as a contract with coherence. I follow the signal. That's it. Not I'm healed. Not I'm fixed. Not I'm cured. Just I follow the signal. Because when your mind starts bargaining, that sentence brings you back to the only thing that matters. Signal over noise, guidance over guessing, repetition over novelty, presence over monitoring. And when you hear long-term practice, don't shrug it. Don't translate it into pressure. Translate it into permission. Permission to be ordinary with it. The review connects effectiveness to things that sound boring on purpose. How often you return, how many sessions you stack, how you're guided, how long you stay. Boring is stable. Boring is predictable. Predictable is safe. Safe is where the system finally stops bracing. The mind calls that nothing is happening. The body calls it training. And safety is where coherence begins to hold. And if you can hold that, you don't need to force progress. You let progress accumulate. At the edge of the shift, the mind will try one last trick. It will demand a sensation. It will demand a guarantee. It will demand something dramatic enough to prove you didn't waste your time. Because drama feels like progress, and quiet feels like nothing. But the real reset rarely announces itself. It reorganizes. It reduces interference. It stops paying attention to the old hooks. And in that silence, coherence begins to return without permission from your thoughts. You don't need to force a breakthrough. You don't need to chase a peak. You don't need to manufacture emotion just to feel on track. That impulse is urgency dressed up as discipline. And urgency is the exact frequency that pulls you back into noise. If you've been waiting for a sign, notice this instead. The body keeps showing up, even when the mind complains, even when the mind says you're bored, even when the mind says nothing is happening. The mind calls it boredom. The body calls it rewiring. Now here's the ritual, not a superstition, a marker, a decision that your system can reference when it wants to drift. Go to the comments and write this sentence exactly. I stay with the signal. Write it like you're placing a seal on the moment, not to convince anyone, not to perform, but to tell your nervous system, we are not returning to urgency for comfort. To tell the mind, you don't get to interrupt coherence with checking. To tell the field, I'm choosing alignment over interference. Then stop negotiating. Stop scanning for instant relief. Stop monitoring your inner state like it owes you a report. Monitoring is interference. Interference is noise. And noise is what delays the arrival you keep trying to force. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not failing because you don't feel fireworks. Fireworks are not resilience. Resilience is what remains stable when you are activated. It is the capacity to return to coherence without collapsing into the old pattern. Breathing practices have been studied in relation to stress and anxiety outcomes. That doesn't mean it will work the same way for everyone. It doesn't mean it guarantees a result. It doesn't replace medical care, therapy, or professional support. Context matters. The way it's practiced matters. The structure of the intervention matters. If you're dealing with severe symptoms or a medical condition, treat this as supportive information, not a treatment plan. And understand what arrival really is. It's not a moment the mind can schedule. It's not a mood you can squeeze out of your day with effort. It's a recalibration that happens when you stop demanding immediate confirmation. When you stop tugging on the plant to see if it's growing. When you stop treating every quiet hour as a problem to solve. That is the sabotage. Not because you're weak, because your system learned to equate urgency with safety. So the first time safety feels neutral, the mind calls it empty. It reaches for stimulation. It reaches for friction. It reaches for anything familiar. But neutrality is not emptiness. Neutrality is the corridor where the old identity loses grip. The new one forms. And if you want a deeper container for this work, check the pinned comment. It's there for those who are ready to practice coherence with guidance, repetition, and structure. No pressure, no urgency. Just a door you can walk through when you're done sabotaging yourself with speed. Because the point was never to feel better on command. The point was to become less reactive to the demand for proof. To stay steady long enough for the signal to strengthen. To stop disrupting the system while it reorganizes. So when it gets quiet again, don't panic. Don't chase. Don't check. Align. Hold the marker. Stay with the signal. You don't chase it. You align. And then it arrives.